You know, when you look back at Europe in the 1990s, it's like two completely different movies were playing at the exact same time. One was this incredible story of unity, of old enemies deciding to build a future together, and the other, it was a horror story of division, of neighbors turning on each other in the first massive war on the continent since World War II. Okay, let's dive into this story of a Europe that was being built and broken all at once.
So, in one part of Europe, you had this incredible vision taking shape, symbolized by places like the European Central Bank. Countries were meticulously, methodically working to create a single market, a single currency. I mean, think about it. They were willingly giving up a piece of their own national power, control over their own money, for this bigger shared European identity. It was a huge achievement, built on peace and cooperation.
But literally right next door, a total nightmare was unfolding. While all these officials in shiny buildings were designing a new union, cities like Sarajevo were being ripped apart by ethnic hate. And this wasn't some far-off conflict. This was happening in Europe's own backyard, a brutal reminder that the urge to break apart was every bit as strong as the dream to unite.
All right, so let's start with that first story, the very careful, very peaceful, and almost bureaucratic process of creating the European Union that we know today.
And believe me, this process was incredibly deliberate. This wasn't some sudden revolution. It was built piece by piece, step by step, over years. It really kicked off with the goal of a single market back in '86. Then came the big one, the Maastricht Treaty in '91, which put the plan for a common currency down on paper. By '99, the euro was real, at least for banks. And then in 2002, people actually had euro coins and bills in their pockets. A dream that people had for generations was now something you could literally hold in your hand.
But joining this club was not easy. The Maastricht Treaty laid out some incredibly tough rules. Countries had to seriously get their economies in shape, control their debt, get inflation under control. But what this really meant was that it was a huge political decision. You were basically agreeing to hand over the keys to your country's monetary policy from your own national bank to a new, shared one in Frankfurt. It was a massive leap of faith in this whole European project.
And now we have to make a really hard turn, because at the same time that this amazing project of unity was moving forward, another country was falling apart with just breathtaking violence. We're talking about the collapse of Yugoslavia.
For decades, this one guy, Marshal Tito, had held this multi-ethnic state together basically through his sheer force of will. But after he died, all those old tensions started bubbling back up to the surface. By 1991, republics like Slovenia and Croatia won it out. They declared independence. And the Serb-dominated army fought to hold it all together by force. The whole state just shattered, violently, right along these ethnic fault lines.
But the absolute worst of it, the most savage part of the conflict, happened in Bosnia. Bosnia was a true melting pot of different ethnic groups. And when it declared independence, that diversity, which should have been a strength, became its greatest vulnerability. Bosnian Serb forces, with a lot of help from the old Yugoslav army, surrounded the capital Sarajevo and started a brutal campaign to carve out an ethnically pure Serb territory.
And tragically, the war in Bosnia gave the world a chilling new phrase: ethnic cleansing. This wasn't just war. This was a systematic campaign of terror aimed at civilians, using violence, rape, and murder to literally erase a group of people from a piece of land. It felt like a throwback to the absolute darkest moments of European history.
And this is the moment where our two stories just crash into each other. The brand new European Union, with all its talk about speaking with one voice, was suddenly facing its first huge foreign policy test. And that test was a horrific war happening right on its own doorstep.
I mean, on paper, the EU was supposed to be ready for this. The very same treaty that created the euro also called for a common foreign and security policy. The idea was that Europe could act decisively as one. But the reality? The EU was paralyzed. Its members just could not agree on what to do. They were completely incapable of stopping the killing.
And that failure exposed a fundamental weakness. The EU was an economic giant, for sure, but it was a military and political dwarf. It just couldn't project power, even in its own neighborhood. In the end, the job of stopping the war fell to the old Cold War alliance, the American-led NATO.
The breaking point finally came in August 1995. After a horrific mortar attack on a marketplace in Sarajevo killed dozens of civilians, that was it. NATO's patience just ran out. A massive 2-week bombing campaign was launched against Bosnian Serb positions, and that is what finally forced them to the negotiating table and changed the course of the war.
So let's talk about what happened next. The bombs stopped, a very fragile peace took hold in the Balkans. And at the very same time, the European Union's integration project, it didn't just keep going. It went into overdrive.
So the war ended with something called the Dayton Agreement. But it was a peace based on separation, not on everyone coming back together. Bosnia was split up into ethnically based regions with 60,000 NATO troops on the ground to keep everyone apart. It was basically a NATO protectorate, a clear sign that the wounds were nowhere near healed.
Now, contrast that with the EU. While the Balkans were being held together by outside forces, the Union was doing the exact opposite. It wasn't breaking apart. It was getting bigger, way bigger. In 2004, it jumped from just 15 members to 25. That's a huge leap.
And you can really get a sense of the scale of this change here. The EU pushed eastward, bringing in so many of the nations that had just broken free from behind the Iron Curtain. This was that whole European idea in action, spreading peace and prosperity across the continent.
But even with this incredible expansion, the ghosts of the Balkans just wouldn't go away. In 1999, another brutal conflict exploded, this time in Kosovo. Serbian forces were carrying out another campaign of ethnic cleansing. And once again, it was NATO, not the EU, that had to step in with military force to stop the killing. So, what do we make of this turbulent decade? Well, it left Europe with this really complicated and contradictory legacy that honestly continues to shape it to this day.
So in the end, the 90s left Europe with this dual legacy. On the one hand, the integration project was a monumental success. It created this huge zone of peace and prosperity. But on the other hand, the EU totally failed its first big security test, unable to stop mass murder in its own backyard. The hard lesson was that having a single currency and a single market did not automatically mean you had a single powerful voice on the world stage.
And this leaves us with a fundamental question that Europe is still wrestling with today. It managed to become a continent united by economics, but in so many ways, it's still deeply divided by the memories of its own history. That tension between those two powerful forces, integration and disintegration, that's the unfinished story of modern Europe. So you have to wonder, what will define its next chapter?